Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming. This is part 10 of our 13-part series on what's new in SQL Server 2012. And some of you have probably been attending for a couple of weeks and have been going through the series, and other people you might be attending for the first time. This is a 13-part series on what's new in SQL Server 2012. A lot of features across the board in this database product, a tremendous new version from Microsoft, and we've been going through the new versions of SQL Server in these 13 weeks. Get into today's demonstration here in just a few minutes. We're looking at new features in PowerPivot 2.0. We actually looked at some last week, but because PowerPivot is certainly big enough of a component that we need a couple of weeks to cover it, so I'm going to finish up what we looked at last week. A little bit of introduction. My name is Kevin Goff. I'm a Microsoft SQL Server MVP. I also train and run the SQL Server Business Intelligence practice for a company called SetFocus. And just a little bit of background information here, and then we'll get started. Again, this is the 13-part series of new features in SQL Server 2012. This is very much a just the facts approach to looking at the new features of the product. I've always been a proponent of lots of demos and limited slides, so I'm just going to go through a couple of slides here and then get into the demonstrations in just a second. A little bit of information about me. Again, I'm a SQL Server MVP. Was a .NET MVP for another years, and then switched over to SQL Server. I write for Code Magazine. As I said, I'm a trainer for a company called SetFocus. If you have any training needs, a couple of URLs that you can check out. First of all, our main company site, if you're interested in training, is www.setfocus.com. We also have a free training site with over 100 hours of free training content. You can go to freetraining.setfocus.com and pull down over 100 hours of free training that's actually lifted from our different curriculums. If you want to send me an email, my email address is kgoff@kevinsgoff.net, and my sort of website /blog is www.kevinsgoff.net. I actually have coverage of these Microsoft webcasts on my blog. So if you go to my blog, kevinsgoff.net, on the right-hand side there's a category devoted to these Microsoft webcasts. Okay, well, we are in week 10, so getting down toward the end here of the new features in SQL Server 2012. In prior weeks, we've looked at the new column store index, new T-SQL features, new SSIS features, new features in the analysis services tabular model, and last week we looked at PowerPivot 2.0. Going to continue that discussion this week. Some components are just so large that we need subsequent weeks to cover it. So we're going to finish PowerPivot today. Now, PowerPivot has a programming language called Dax. Stands for Data Analysis Expressions, and next week we're going to look at DAX code in detail. And then in the coming weeks we're going to look at the reporting services integration capabilities with SharePoint 2010, and then in the final week we're going to look at the new data visualization tool called Power View. So as I said, we're finishing up PowerPivot this week. Just as a quick review from last week, PowerPivot, first of all, it was actually introduced. Version 1.0 was introduced back in the late spring of 2010, so it's going on 2 years old. PowerPivot is part of what Microsoft and many others have termed as self-service business intelligence. It allows end users and power users to create analytic databases without necessarily needing to run to an OLAP developer or a database developer every 5 minutes to put something together. So it allows end users or power users to point to different data sources, whether it's relational databases, data marts, or even text files or spreadsheets, and create the equivalent of a star schema OLAP database under the hood in Excel. Now, it's not intended to be a full-blown replacement for analysis services. It's not going to scale the same way that analysis services can scale, but it's good for what some people call personal BI or maybe small department BI. So it's an alternative to creating smaller OLAP databases, maybe ones that are under 2 gigabytes in size, when there's no developer around to create analytic databases. So end users can take data from different sources and put them into a PowerPivot database inside of Excel. Some people have termed PowerPivot as one big V lookup. It's a really an interesting way to describe PowerPivot, but certainly not untrue. It allows people to relate different data together automatically through the capabilities of PowerPivot under the hood. Now, many aspects of PowerPivot, if you're familiar with the new tabular model, there's some aspects to PowerPivot that are very similar to the tabular model. We create relationships in much the same way. We can create calculations and KPIs and even hierarchies in much the same way. Now, PowerPivot uses the X-Velocity engine, formerly known as Vertipack, under the hood. So it's able to take sources of data and compress them in a PowerPivot database under the hood in Excel. Now, as I said last week, there are two parts to PowerPivot. There's the Excel component, where end users can again point to different data sources and create PowerPivot content inside of Excel and create pivot tables and pivot charts, much in the same way that they can do so against full-blown OLAP databases. And those spreadsheets can be shared on a file share. Well, there's also a SharePoint integration component that we're going to look at in a little bit more detail this week. And that SharePoint integration component allows people to deploy Excel PowerPivot content up to SharePoint. So we're going to look at that this week. So once Excel content with a PowerPivot database inside has been pushed up to SharePoint, other users can interact with it either directly in SharePoint or even create reports off of it using new reporting tools from Microsoft in SQL 2012 like Power View. So the scenarios for PowerPivot might be when no formal corporate BI exists, or maybe where corporate BI exists but PowerPivot is used to supplement those corporate BI solutions. Maybe when an end user, maybe a small collection of users, might need to create a mashup of data that maybe doesn't exist in the corporate BI solution at the moment. Now today we're going to sort of pick up where I left off in last week's demo. Now last week's demo I had created a PowerPivot database using sales information from a fictional book publisher. And we looked at building some relationships. We looked at building some calculations and KPIs. We even looked at a bridge table relationship involving a relationship between books and authors. Well, today we're going to look at a few more calculations with Dax, even though next week we're going to look at Dax in formal detail. We're going to look at creating hierarchies. We're going to look at scheduling data refreshes when the underlying database changes. And we're going to look at accessing PowerPivot content from tools like reporting services and performance point services. So, going to share my desktop. So I'm going to toggle here and go over to my machine. And give this a second here. So last week, just as a quick review, I took data from a SQL Server database that I created called Book Sales DM that was structured very much like a book sales data mart. And in here we had some fact tables for things like fact book sales and fact book returns and fact book return thresholds, where we had return threshold rates by book category, or excuse me, by customer category and by year. So this is built much in the same way that a traditional data mart or data warehouse might be put together. And then we actually used Excel. And I just now realized I had two versions of Management Studio open. Certainly don't need two of them, so I'm going to close one. And then over in Excel, we went to the PowerPivot window inside of Excel, and we actually pointed to that underlying database, and we wound up pulling forward some of the tables. So we wound up pulling forward the fact tables down at the bottom, the fact return thresholds, which again had the return thresholds by year and by customer category. We brought forward fact book sales, which had sales dollars by by customer and by date and by sales type and by the instance of the book price. We had fact book returns for instances of return dollars by customer and by date and by location and by book. And we had some different business dimensions. We had a date dimension where we had built a calendar back in the original database that we want to use to be able to slice data by things like month and quarter and year and week ending date and so forth. And we had other basic dimension like a customer dimension and a book dimension and the history of book prices related to a book. And then we had authors as well. And we had a bridge table that related books to authors, since one book could be written by multiple authors, and an author might possibly write multiple books. And so we were able to use this to process within Excel the equivalent of an underlying OLAP database, so that end users can up in Excel use some of the new features in Excel 2010 like visual slicers to be able to break out sales by year and by, in this case, customer category, to look at things like the sum of sales dollars and the sum of returns and the returns percent and the returns goal and things like that. And we also constructed a KPI. We constructed a KPI that compared the returns goal, which again was by year and by customer category, to the actual returns percent. So we see here the quantum books is actually below the threshold. It's better to be below the threshold than above, so we get a green light here indicating that that's good. And then we have other ones where the return percent is maybe slightly above the goal, so that's showing in a yellow, which might be okay or a warning or however the company views it. And if somebody had a returns percent that was well above the goal, then we would show that in red. So that's where we left off. That's where we left off last week. Now, I see there's a question that came up right away, so I'll take care of this one. Question is, if a user purchases a new computer with just Windows 7 installed, what else needs to be installed to store data and use PowerPivot? Well, if someone simply wants to point to some data source and use PowerPivot with Excel in standalone mode, they'll need to have Office 2010 installed, and specifically Excel 2010. Because PowerPivot can only utilize Excel 2010. They'll also have to pull down the free PowerPivot download. You can actually, if you do a web search on PowerPivot download, you can actually pull down the free download for PowerPivot 2.0. So the PowerPivot component inside of Excel is free. Now, if you want to deploy this up to SharePoint, that's a completely different story. You need to be in an environment that has SharePoint. But at least to be doing what I'm doing now, you simply need Excel, you need the PowerPivot component add-on, and you need to be able to point to some database. In my case, I'm pointing to a SQL Server database. Now, if you already are in an environment where you have access to a SQL Server database, then that'll already be available. All right. Well, I want to pick up where we left off last week. I want to enhance this a little bit more. So I'm going to do a combination of some things that are more on the database development side with PowerPivot, and I'm also going to show some of the few Excel niceties in 2010. So I'm going to go back and forth between some database functionality and some UI functionality. Well, first of all, definitely more on the UI side. These slicers up here, which I actually created by dragging the corresponding database components. So in the date dimension, we had the year. Well, I dragged the year into the horizontal slicer area along with the customer category from the customer dimension. Well, you have capabilities to do things like Stylee Slicers visually. So I can click on the year slicer and go to the options area, and I have some slicer styles. Now, this is obviously a subjective thing, but I can use a dark color scheme here for the year and go to the customer category and pick a different scheme. And you might standardize on that across sheets. So if you had 3 or 4 sheets, you would probably use the same colors. Now, other things, for instance, end users, if they're utilizing this as a vehicle for reporting, might not want to necessarily show the grid lines in the background. Well, obviously, you can go to the page layout and uncheck the grid lines, so it has a slightly better background effect. All right, well, I want to push this up into SharePoint. I want to actually push this up into SharePoint and interact with it. Now, I already have a site collection that I had set up ahead of time. I actually have a site collection that I had actually built last week in SharePoint where I can publish this. So if I click the File drop-down and take the option to Save and Send inside of Excel, and then Save to SharePoint. Well, I already built a site collection called MS Webcast PowerPivot Gallery up in SharePoint last week. So I'm going to save back up to that area. So I'll double click on that location. And there's actually a PowerPivot gallery that's been set up ahead of time. And I had published this last week. I'll publish it again. Now I'll go to the Publish options, and maybe I want to publish just the first two sheets, one for returns and one for authors. So I'll click OK, and then I'll take the option to save. That is actually pushing up the definition of the sheet along with the underlying data. Keep in mind that this data was copied from the original SQL Server database and loaded into the PowerPivot content here in Excel. This is now being uploaded into SharePoint. Well, this is going to pop up the SharePoint site collection in just a moment here. That data is actually going along with it. So unlike a standard OLAP application where the Excel sheet is just simply a sheet and it points to a data source, well, this site collection that's coming up right now, so we'll give it a second to load. Or 2 seconds, the case might be. Well, I'm actually looking at the sheet up in SharePoint, and I'm going to go back one link. I'm actually going to go to the PowerPivot gallery. This sent me directly into the content. I'm going to take a step back to the PowerPivot gallery itself. Now, the PowerPivot gallery is just simply a document library that's actually running Silverlight under the hood, so that we can get some basic visualizations in this gallery. For instance, if I go to the library area, I can actually change this to a carousel view. And the user has the ability to flip through the different worksheets that have been deployed. Well, I'll click on the returns, and again, that actually launches the sheet with the data inside of it. So if you remember, this was initially built from a SQL Server database. Well, the data from that database was copied and compressed and placed up here. Oops, let me come back to SharePoint and pushed up into the SharePoint site. So it's now disconnected from the data. Well, that raises a pretty big question. What happens when the underlying data changes? Because right now, as I'm navigating, if I go look at 2007 for a particular category, again, that's reading from the PowerPivot database that's part of the sheet that's been published up to Excel or published up to SharePoint. If I were to go back to SQL Management Studio, and if I were to do something like update the sales or the returns figures, for instance, I might say update Factbook returns, and just for the heck of it, I'll say set return dollars equal to return dollars minus 100. I'm simply going to update all the return dollars and yank out another $100 from it to make it even lower. If I take a look at the raw data, if I say select star from Factbook returns, well, the returns are expressed in here as return dollars as a negative amount. So what happens if I change the number here? Well, by default, that's not going to have any impact on the data that's up here in the deployed version of the sheet in SharePoint, because that PowerPivot database is now separate from that underlying SQL Server database. The numbers here would still be the same. Well, that's obviously not a very good thing, because that means that this data is static and is therefore stale and is out of date. Well, fortunately, there's a refresh capability that exists, and we're going to take a look at that next. So let's say, I'll do this right now. Let's say that return dollars winds up changing, that we wind up yanking out $100, or we wind up making the return dollars even greater because it's a negative number to begin with. How do we get it to change here? Well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write down a number. For 2007, for Internet customers, the total sum of the return dollars is $3,518,733. So I'm going to open up Notepad, and I'm going to write down that number, because we're going to want to hold on to that number. So that number is $3,519,733. So that's what exists right now. Well, I'm going to set up a data refresh. I'm going to come back to the PowerPivot gallery. Here's how we can set up a data refresh. Now, as you can probably imagine, this is going to work optimally against databases that are updated on a periodic basis. The problem with using PowerPivot against a relational database that's going to change every 30 seconds is we'd have to be doing data refreshes constantly. So this is obviously better against a data mart or a data warehouse or some other source that's updated on a periodic basis. So first of all, I'm going to actually run this update right now. So I updated the factbook returns. Well, back here in the PowerPivot gallery, if I go back into returns, that still is $3,519,733. And even if I go to distribution centers and go back to internet, it's still that $3,519,733. So how do we get that to change? Well, here's what we do. I'm going to go to the PowerPivot gallery, and I am going to actually go to the Manage Data Refresh. There's an option to schedule a refresh for PowerPivot content. Now, if you'll notice, I actually, ahead of time, I had done one early this morning just as a test. But I'm going to actually change the schedule. So I'm going to go in and configure the schedule. Now, initially, this is checked off. I need to obviously check this on. So I enable the data refresh. Now, I might do it daily. I might do it weekly. I might do it monthly. And if you've ever built jobs in SQL Server Agent, you know, this is very similar to it, except it's providing a visual layer on top of it. So I'm going to do it every day, and I'm going to do it at 12:30. So I'm going to change this and do it at 12:30 p.m. Now, here on the East Coast, it's actually 12:24, so I've got just a little over 5 minutes to go here. So I'm going to do this every day at 12:30 p.m. Now, I don't have email really configured on my local instance of SharePoint, so this isn't going to, I'm not going to do anything with the notifications, but I could set up a notification if I wanted to in case this wound up failing. Now, notice the credentials. There's some different options in here for credentials. I'm running on my local SharePoint server as an administrator. Obviously, end users are not going to be doing that. So there's an option for whether or not the data refresh is going to be configured by the administrator, which happens to be me. I've got a refresh account that was configured by the administrator, by me, as part of the underlying secure store service for PowerPivot. I'll show that a little bit later. We could do it based upon the Windows credentials, or we could do it if there's a secure store, a specific secure store service credentials that was stored in the sheet. We could actually specify that. So, depending upon the environment, you might be picking any one of these. Because I'm running everything under my administrator account here on SharePoint for testing purposes, I can get away with using the first option. Now, notice how there are multiple data sources that we could check on. It's very possible that the PowerPivot content could span multiple data sources. And so maybe we want a particular refresh schedule to affect one but not both sources. In this case, it's just simply one source. So I'll just simply take OK. And so that refresh schedule has been set up. Now, very important, and anybody who's done refreshes in PowerPivot can attest to this. I need to go back to Excel and I need to close this because I just deployed this up to SharePoint. Well, if I leave this alone and wait till 12:30, it's very possible that the refresh might fail because there is still a file handle being open associated with the deploy to SharePoint. So in order for this to work, I have to be out of this. So I'm going to close Excel. And just to avoid any caching here on my machine, I'm actually going to close my browser. And I'll keep Management Studio open. There's no harm in having Management Studio open. It's not like there are any transactions that are running. So I do not have Excel nor SharePoint open. Now I'm gonna filibuster here for a few minutes and wait until maybe about 2 or 3 minutes after 12:30. If I go up there immediately at 12:30, the refresh might not take place. It usually takes could be a minute, could be 2 minutes. It depends upon the size of the data and any of the things going on in SharePoint. But again, it's important to remember what's going on here. And I'll even, since I like to draw in paint, even though I'm not a very good artist here, essentially what's going on is that we in Excel we used Excel, and specifically we used PowerPivot under the hood in Excel to go point to some relational database. So I'm not using actual database diagrams here, so have to forgive me for the poor shapes I'm using here. But here is the relational data mart. Well, I pointed to that data mart for the source, and that actually wound up copying the data into that PowerPivot content database inside of Excel. Well, I wound up publishing that to SharePoint. So that that database got published up to SharePoint in a site collection. So I actually have in my site collection in SharePoint the PowerPivot content that an end user can go up and slice and dice with, even if they don't have Excel, because it's just purely running under the control of SharePoint in a browser. But the problem is that when this data changes, as it's going to do on some periodic basis, when the data changes here, it's not automatically going to be seen by the PowerPivot content here, because remember, that was deployed up, disconnected from the database. Well, what we have to do, and what I just did, is we have to set up a refresh schedule. So we have to define a refresh schedule so that when that job runs, that will reload the data based upon whatever rules we define for what tables we wanted to begin with. That'll reload it back into that PowerPivot content area up in SharePoint. And so at about, I'm going to wait until about 12:32, 12:33 and go back up there, and that data should change. If you remember, when we looked at 2007 for Internet, it was 3,519,000. It should wind up being different as a result. Well, we'll be able to see, even with the history of the refresh schedule, we'll be able to see exactly when it refreshed. So the thing to keep in mind is that PowerPivot content, even though it's compressed, even though it's going to be a fraction of the size of the original data, it is static at that point. It's not automatically going to change as a result of the change to the database unless we set up some type of a refresh schedule. So again, we'll go back up in just a minute or two and make sure that the data has indeed changed. So give it, let's see, we got 12:30 right now. Give it another minute and a half, and we'll go back up. Now this was the same functionality in PowerPivot 1. PowerPivot 1 had the same functionality when it was released back in May of 2010. So the refresh schedule hasn't changed. I have personally ran into some situations where in PowerPivot 1 sometimes the refresh schedule, there were times where the refresh schedule wouldn't fire. There did seem to be a few quirks from time to time, at least some of the experiences I had in production. Those seem to have been addressed in 2.0. So PowerPivot 2.0 across the board, simply a significant update over PowerPivot 1. Okay, give it another minute here. Now, after we check the refresh and make sure that works, you can actually look at creating another sheet and put in a few more Dax calculations. I'm going to come up with a calculation for a moving average, where we might want to show over the course of 12 months the average sales over the prior 12 months. Well, in this case, we're actually going to need to build a couple of calculations to determine if we're building a moving average, what's the range of months. Because if we're in one particular month, we have to figure what's the range of the last 12 months. So we'll have to actually create a couple of formulas there. So wait for another 10 seconds, and I'll go back up to my site collection. And I think I had written down the URL for that. Yep, it's right here. So we'll copy that site collection URL and go back to my browser and go back to that site collection. And I will go take a look at the refresh schedule before I do anything else. I'll go take a look at the Manage Data Refresh area. And notice that first of all that ran. So we get the green checkbox there. That's good news. That took 1:20 to run, so that's why it was good I gave it to 2 minutes. That did give me a message here because I actually altered the schedule, because I had initially had it under one definition and then changed it. Well, if I actually go back to the PowerPivot gallery and take a look at the data and take a look at the returns, and I'll go to 2007 for internet, which was the number that I'd written down. Well, a while ago that was, what was the number that I had written down here? That was 3,519,000. It's now 4,776,000. So the return percentage has wound up going up because I increased the return dollars by adding more negative value to it. So that's how we set up a data refresh inside of PowerPivot. Well, I'll close the browser here, and I will go back into the Excel sheet. So I'll launch Excel. And I'll open that sheet. Now, once in a great while, if you open up something after a refresh, you might get initialization of the data source fail. That's because I'm actually going out and pointing to the version added in SharePoint. I'm going to click OK on this. There's actually no problem here. And wait for this to load the content database. And now I'm back in development mode. Well, I'm gonna build another sheet here. So I'm gonna go out to sheet 2, and I'm gonna create one, and I'm gonna call it Moving Average Chart. So I'm gonna rename this sheet, and I'll call it Moving Average Chart. Well, I want to pull the same content that I pulled from the first two sheets. I want to get that field list here. Well, what I can do in the new sheet is I can go to Data, and I can go to Existing Connections and reference the PowerPivot data connection and create a new pivot table. And I'm going to go down, and I'm going to go to Factbook Sales, and I'm going to sum the sales dollars. I'm pulling the core revenue. Now I'm going to allow someone to break that out by year and by one of the categories. So I'll go up to dim dates, and I'll take the year and I'll put that in the slicer area. This time I'll put it on the left-hand side, and I'll pick one particular year. I'll pick 2007, and I'll let someone pick one of the customer categories. So I'll go to dim customers, and I'll let someone pick a customer category, whether it's all or just internet or whatever. You can actually clear the filter by clicking on the clear filter icon, and that brings back all the categories. Well, then I'll go up to the month dimension, or excuse me, to the date dimension, and I'll take the month description and put that down in the rows. November, and okay, just now realize I've got 11 months here, not 12. Not sure why I don't have December there, but I'm not gonna bother looking at the data. Normally it'd have 12 months here. Might have been something I did, but we'll just pretend that this is 12 months. Well, I might want to show some additional measures here, like for instance, in April of 07, I might want to know what was the sales the same time period a year ago. And I also might want to know what were the sales for the last 12 months based upon April. So in other words, going back from March of 07 to April of 06, what was the average monthly sales over the last 12 months? And if I'm in March of 07, what was the average sales over the last 12 months going back from February of 07 to March of 06? In other words, a moving average. Well, if you've ever built a moving average before, you know that it's certainly not a trivial calculation. And in this instance, if we want to average the dollar sales over the last 12 months, well, we need to know what that range of 12 months happen to be. And so ahead of time, and bear with me, I'm going to close a few windows here so that when I'm tabbing around, I don't have as many windows. So I'm going to close that, and I also had the dollar amount from the refresh. I'll close that. And close some other windows here. And then if I go out to another file in Notepad that I had open, well, I've got some existing calculations that I'm going to paste in. One of them is for a moving average. Now, in a moving average, essentially what I want to do is I want to determine the average sales over a range of dates. And notice how I have two definitions here for start month and end month. Well, based upon whatever the current month happens to be, I want to go back 1 month and then go back 12 months. So I need to have two calculations here for start month and end month. So I'm going to have to place those into here as well. Now, I had shown how you could actually put calculations back in the original pivot table, Power Pivot table back in the Power Pivot content. We can also do them here. So I can actually, in fact, book sales. I can right-click and create a new calculation here, and I will call it start month. And the calculation here, essentially what we want to do is we want to take whatever the current date is, and then go backwards 12 months using the Dax function date add to go back 12 months and get the first day of that month. And so I'm going to paste this calculation into the formula area here. And I'll check the formula, and it's okay. Now, I intentionally put this in here into the measures area because I want to actually see what I'm getting here. So in April of 07, a 12-month range is going to start back in April of 06. So I temporarily want to have these here to test them out. Well, then I'll right-click on FactBook Sales again and add another measure. And this one will be the end of month. The end month of that 12-month range. That's going to be the whatever the current month is, subtracting 1 month from it using date add to subtract 1 month, and get the last day of that month. So if I copy this and paste it in, Well, now I see in here that for April of '07, if I want to get the average sales over the last 12 months, that 12-month range is going to be from April the 1st of '06 to March the 31st of '07. And in May of '07, it's going to be from May of '06 to the end of April of '07. Notice how I'm not including the current month in the calculation. When some people build a moving average, they might include the current month or they might not. Well, that would determine whether or not we would go back 12 months or 11, and whether we would go back 1 month or simply use the current month. Well, now that we have the two definitions a month, what I need to do is have a definition of the average sales. So essentially, I want to have a measure in here called average sales that's going to sum the sales dollars from Factbook sales and divide it by how many months are found in an observation range. So notice how I've got to count rows of the distinct number of months over that 12-month range, or whatever the range happens to be. So I will create another calculation here called average sales. So I'll right-click and add a new measure, and I will call it average sales. And again, that's going to be the sum of the sales dollars divided by the count of the number of unique instances a month that are discovered in whatever range we wind up building for the moving average. So a little bit of abstraction here. So click OK. Now, notice how that, at the moment, is the same as the sum of dollars, because we haven't told it that we want to do this over a range of dates yet. So right now, it's simply averaging what it has for the current month. Well, it's the same value. Well, now we're finally going to top this off by having the moving average calculation that's going to run the concept of this average sales over a range of dates between the start month and the end month. So that'll eventually be the moving average. So I will right-click on Factbook Sales one more time and add one more measure, and we'll call this moving average. And then I'll paste this entire formula in. And again, starting next week, we're going to be looking at DAX more in detail. So I'm kind of exposing some DAX calculations early, but next week we're going to look at these formulas in more detail and also other formulas in DAX. So I'll click OK. Well, now we get the moving average. So now we get, what is that, 4,836,519. That is the average dollars, the average sales over the range from May of '06 to April of '07. Now, some people might do this as a 52-week average. Some people might do it as a 12-month average. Some people might do it as a daily average. The point is that this is a moving average over a range. The reason we call it moving is because the 12-month range moves with each subsequent row. Well, I want to do one more thing. I want to show the sales dollars the prior year. Well, there's actually a couple of ways that can be done. One way is with a function called same period last year. There's also another one called parallel period. I'm going to talk about the differences between those two next week. There's some scenarios where you might want to use one and some scenarios where you might want to use another. Well, essentially what I want to do is I want to sum fact sales across all the range of dates we might possibly be looking at for the same period last year. So I will add one more measure here, and this will be sales last year, essentially sales same time period a year ago, and I'll use the function same period last year. So I'll paste that in and check the formula. And I wind up getting, in June of '07, the sales for the same time period a year ago was 4,474,459. Well, the easy way to test that is to go back 1 year. Now, I always provide the provision that sometimes sometimes these are very rehearsed demos, and other times they're a little bit off the cuff. So there's always a possibility. I always throw that provision in here that that some of the numbers might not necessarily be correct, but I'll take a leap of faith here that I'm right. So that 4,744,000 should show over here if I run this for 06. And it does. So that calculation for same period last year is indeed working. Well, I want to get rid of the start month, end month, and average sales because all I want is the moving average and the sales last year. Well, I'll come over here and I'll uncheck them. So I don't want the start month, don't want the end month, and I don't want the average sales. I simply want the moving average. Now I'll format these as currencies. So I'll click on each column heading, and format both of these as currency. There we go. And same thing here. Format that as currency. And there we go. Well, I might want to plot this as a chart. I might want to plot this as a chart showing the sales dollars, the sum of sales dollars, and the sales last year. Maybe one of them is a column chart and the other is a line. Well, here's what I'll do with this pivot table selected. Now, first of all, I want to plot the months, but I don't want to plot that grand total. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to right-click on the pivot table options, and I'm going to go to totals and filters. I don't want to show totals. I just want to plot each individual month. Well, I will insert a column chart, and I'll stretch this out. Now, I'm certainly not trying to turn this into an Excel training session, but a few things that we can do in Excel here. Well, first of all, the moving average I might want to show as a line chart with markers. So I can right-click on that moving average, and I can change the series chart type and actually make that a line chart with markers. So that moving average is now showing as a line. And the same thing with sales last year. I'll click on sales last year, right-click, change the chart type, and make that a line chart with markers as well. And then I might want to put that over top of the pivot table because this is actually what I want the user to see in something like SharePoint. So Excel builds a very nice chart almost right off the bat. Not a whole lot that we need to do here. Now I can style certain things. For instance, I might want to change the background here. Now the only problem is that this might look very nice here, but deployed in a SharePoint, sometimes any gradient fills we use or any other special colors might not necessarily come in quite as well. So we'll push this up into SharePoint in just a second. Now, because back in the first chart I'd shown year in red and customer category in blue, I might want to be consistent here. I might want to do the same thing. I might want to go to the options and use the same color for consistency here as well as here. You can change the name. If I don't like the word customer category, if I want to abbreviate it, I can right-click and go to the slicer settings, and I can change that caption. I can just simply put a space in there. So we can change the caption as well to make it more English-like. And again, I'll get rid of the grid lines there. And I'll push this up to SharePoint. So I'll click the file drop down and take Save and Send and save to SharePoint. And I'll push this content database back up. And actually, I want to take a look at something here. I want to go back into the Publish options. I need to publish that moving chart as well. And once this is deployed back up, Well, an end user can interact with this in the same way. So I can look at the sales and the moving average and the sales last year. So notice how the moving average hasn't been changing a whole lot. I probably wanted to stretch this out, maybe use a smaller marker. But the sales last year is all over the place. Well, if I go take a look at a different customer category, if I look at it just for internet, well, the values in the chart here are obviously going to change. I can take a couple of seconds for that to refresh the first time, especially when I'm running everything on one local machine. So we'll give this a second here. And that chart wound up changing. Obviously, the numbers came down because I'm looking at it for just one customer category. Well, what we're beginning to see here is almost a moderately scaled reporting system that we can set up here in a PowerPivot gallery. This is what makes PowerPivot so attractive for certain types of maybe personal BI or small departmental BI solutions. Now let me come back to the PowerPivot gallery here and we'll take a look at something new. We're seeing more than just a spreadsheet up here. There is actually a reference to the PowerPivot content database that we can reference through a URL. For instance, let's say that someone, a reporting services developer, wanted to build a report that could only be done in reporting services, maybe because SSRS has some specific features. And we want to run it against the underlying content database for this PowerPivot content. Well, coming back here, this content database can actually be referenced with a connection string. So I could actually go into reporting services and use this type of connection string here. That's exactly what I'm going to do. Now I need to format this correctly. So the actual full data source here is going to be my my webcast PowerPivot gallery, and specifically the gallery here. And we have to actually put in %20 for the spaces. And then it's going to be the name of the sheet, which was, what did I call that? Book sales content. I can actually go into reporting services, use that as a data source, and point to that sheet and build a report off of it. So watch this. I'm going to open up SQL Server Data Tools. And in SQL Server Data Tools, I'm going to create a basic reporting services project. And I will call it SSRS project from PowerPivot. And just in the same way that we can build reports off of relational databases and we can build reports off of OLAP databases, we can also build reports off of PowerPivot databases that have been deployed up to SharePoint. So I'm going to go to Share Data Sources and I'm going to add a new data source. I'll call this DS PowerPivot. Now for the connection string, because the PowerPivot content uses the Analysis Services Engine under the hood, I'm going to actually select Analysis Services Engine. And I'm going to paste in that entire connection string here, where the provider is Microsoft OLAP and the data source is that spreadsheet. So let me paste that in. Now I need to go to the credentials, and in this case I'm going to use Windows Authentication. Well, I'll build a report off of there. So and it'll be a very, very simple report. So I'll go to reports and I will add a new item. And I'll build just an extremely simple report off of that source. So I'll create a report. I'll just call it report 1. I'm not even going to give it a name. And I'm going to create a data set off of that report. And I'll just call this DS returns, and it'll be a data set embedded in the report, and I have to create an instance of a data source that refers to that shared data source. And watch what happens when I go into the query designer. This is really cool. And I am not exaggerating when I say this. This is pretty awesome. If you've ever built a report against an OLAP database, you might say, wow, this is just like building a report off of an OLAP database. Well, that's because, in essence, we are. Remember, that deployed spreadsheet up in SharePoint is accessible through that connection string. And the Analytic Services Engine is working with the PowerPivot data under the hood. So I can go to Factbook Returns, and I can pull in the sum of the return dollars. And I can pull in the returns percent. And I can break that apart by customer. So I'll go down to dim customers and break it apart by customer category. And also break it apart by year. So I'll go to dim dates and drag in year. I'm actually bringing back the sum of the return dollars and the returns percent by category and year. Well, once I've got a data set of that information, and I could even set up in the dimension slicer up here to allow somebody to do this from the book category, to allow someone to pick any one of the book categories and make that a parameter. Well, I'll bring in a table object. I'm not gonna style this. I'm not gonna make it look fancy in any way. Just going to create a basic table and refer to each one of those columns. So there's a customer category. Here's the year. Here's the return dollars, and then one more column for the returns percent. Not going to look at adding totals or anything like that. Just keeping this very basic. I'll preview this report. We're going to be wrapping up here in just a minute. Looks like I had a timeout, which is possible. Again, I'm running a lot of things here locally. Let me see if I can possibly get that to run again. Timeout issue, which doesn't shock me. Let me save this, close this, and try to run it again. If not, I may have to just show this next week. It looks like it's nothing more than a timeout issue. I'll try this again. You know what? Okay, this has worked before. Something is going on my machine, and we're nearing the end here. So I will take a look at this, and we'll talk about this at the very beginning. This has run before, so something has gone on here that I'll need to take care of. Obviously, back in the original data set, we're able to make the connection to the underlying data, which is the most important thing. We're actually pulling the data from the PowerPivot content database. Some reason having a problem previewing it, I'll check into that. That's worked before. Something is going on here. Now, the last thing to talk about is the fact that any tool that can reference an OLAP database using a connection string can use this connection string to create a report or create a chart. So even in performance point services, if you want to build some type of a KPI scorecard or other type of performance point content off of that deployed database, you can do so. And so, again, that database, that PowerPivot content database sitting up in that PowerPivot gallery gives us a lot of capabilities. There's one other one. I'm going to talk about this for just a second, and then we will wrap up for the day. Notice there's another link here that says Create Power View Report. This is something new in SQL Server 2012. If I click on Power View, this launches a Silverlight enabled application that allows an end user or a power user in SharePoint to create a web-based report using some built-in reporting and charting capabilities. So I could go to Factbook Sales and pull in the sales dollars. And let me stretch this out. And then maybe look at it by the month. So I'll go up to the date dimension and break this out by month description. And then come up here to the drop down and maybe build this as a column chart. And then maybe set up a filter to run this for a year. So in here there's the ability to define that maybe I would filter the sales on a year. There are different visualizations in here with different types of charts and table and matrix capabilities. You can also build separate reports and charts as almost in a storyboard fashion, and then save this, and it actually gets saved back to that same site collection. I only came in here for a split second just to demonstrate that we can do this. The very last week of this 13-part series, we're actually going to take a look at Power View in detail. This is just a quick teaser of what is capable here. So I'll just simply take OK. I'm going to navigate away from here. The point is that we can take deployed PowerPivot content or content that's been deployed from the tabular model and actually launch this new Power View report visualization tool. So we'll take a look at that in a couple weeks. So that takes us to the end here. So let me come back to the slide deck real quick. So next week, we're going to take a look more in detail at Dax. So I'm going to be focusing on Dax Formulas. We're going to look at about a dozen different examples of Dax. Now, one or two are going to be from examples I've looked at already, like the moving average and determining sales for the same time period last year. We're going to look at some more advanced Dax formulas. One of them we're going to look at is generate, which is something that exists over in MDX. Also going to look at how we might use Dax to help us out with some more advanced fact dimension data modeling relationships. You might remember that I had to use some Dax code to relate author sales because we don't sell an author, we sell a book. But we had the bridge table. So if we wanted to express sales in terms of author dollars and even calculate the ratio, we had to use a Dax formula. There are other scenarios where the only way to have more complicated fact dimension relationships is by throwing some Dax code in the mix. So next week, on next Friday, same time here, going to look at Dax code formulas. So thank you all for coming, and again, my email address. Let me come back here is kgoff@kevinsgoff.net if you want to drop me an email. My website is www.kevinsgoff.net. So feel free to check out my site, check out the coverage of this webcast, and feel free to email me if you have any questions. Actually, someone asked a question at the very end here. For some of my demonstrations, I use Windows Authentication for the data source connection. That's certainly true. I often do that just for simplicity. If you gave the application to a different user who's not an administrator, what do they have to do so the application will work? That's where the concept of a secure store service might come in. You might funnel all of the access through one or more secure store service IDs. So you might set up in SharePoint a secure store service ID. This is the equivalent. If you remember back in SharePoint 2007, there was the SSO, the single sign-on ID. Well, you can set up a secure store service ID and then funnel all the access through Excel services and into SharePoint with PowerPivot through that secure store service. So if Windows authentication isn't being used, and if you don't necessarily want to set up Windows authentication in SharePoint, you might funnel all the access through a secure store service. So that might be one way to do it. So if that answer doesn't, if you have follow-up questions, person's name was Bill. Bill, feel free to email me again. It's kgoffin@kevinsgoff.net. So again, thank you for coming, and see you next week. Same time, same station. We'll be taking a look at Dax code. So have a good holiday weekend. Have a safe holiday weekend, and hope to see you back here next Friday. So long. Have a good day.